Welcome to the Wooper Club League Season 12 Draft Breakdown. We are entering into Scarlet and Violet with authority, and we're excited to go over some of the changes for the season, as well as the truly excellent teams assembled by our talented coaches. I am IllLogic, I'm coach of the Buffalo Bouffalant, and I'll be leading us through this breakdown. As always, I am joined by co-commissioner SteveChuck, coach of the Waterdeep Wobbuffets.
Hello, everybody.
Steve's done a great job leading us through some much-needed discussions, which we'll get to in a bit, as well as with recruitment to make this the biggest WCL season to date. If that's the case, then what better way to complete our trio of commentary than with the back-to-back champion of Seasons 10 and 11, Michael, aka FruitTaco, coach of the Route 1 Birbs.
Hey, it's great to be back. That's right, it wasn't a fluke, it was two flukes.
And Michael's looking for that third fluke in a row. And you already know I cannot let anyone else achieve that in our league. But it's obviously a very different landscape now that we're in a new generation. I'll start with you on this, Michael. The mons we have access to have changed dramatically. Without DLC, we're missing a lot of mons. Without home, the mons we do have are missing quite a few staple moves. And there's talk that this gen's power creep may be the most significant to date. Despite all that, we're also keeping the new mechanic of terrestrialization, something we voted on just before Smogon also decided to keep it in. Okay, that was a lot. Take us through some of your thoughts on the upheaval Gen 9 brought to the Draft League meta.
Yeah, I mean, on top of just, new toy syndrome and wanting to play with all of the new Gen 9 mons, like you mentioned, a lot of the old Pokemon that are in need to get heavily reevaluated. Things like Toxic, things like Heal Bell and Aromatherapy, Knockoff, all of those things getting heavily restricted in distribution or basically unavailable really makes things that used to be staple picks just completely ineffective at what they used to do. So really a lot of reevaluating Pokemon on top of, like you said, power creep, new Pokemon, finding out what is going to be a good Terra abuser, figuring out how to abuse Terra in the first place, as well as just going through the draft. I felt there were some strange areas kind of in the pool of Pokemon where, where there were roles or types or stat distributions that just were really limited to compared to other gens, to where after, just 2 or 3 rounds, you're like, well, is it even worth drafting a Pokemon of this type anymore?
I definitely know what you mean. There are going to be some interesting stacked up weaknesses and stats and such that we haven't seen before. Steve, there's a lot to go through here too, but if you could please take us through this all kind of in the context of some of the decisions we had to make, from allowing terrestrialization at all to some of the more significant bans of Pokemon moves, etc.
So yes, as you mentioned, initially we did decide to allow terrestrialization in general. There's no Terra Captors or anything like that. Any Pokemon can terrestrialize with, of course, a couple of sections. We did limit it on specific mons that we felt would be too powerful with it, including Chien-Pao, Iron Valiant, Garchomp, Roaring Moon, Chi-Yu, Dragonite, Palafin, and Magikarp, of course. With all of those abusers kind of removed, we're hoping that some of the other mons can use it to shine. Additionally, we decided to restrict some of the new moves and some items that make some moves very good. Last Respects is not being allowed, Shed Tail's not being allowed, and then King's Rock and Leppa Berry as well are being removed. In addition to those lists, there are, of course, just straight-up bans, Pokemon that we felt are too powerful to allow in the draft. Of course, the box art legendaries, Koraidon and Miraidon, and to join them, Fluttermane, Dragapult, Iron Bundle, and, of course, Combee.
And of course, too, there is a human aspect to this. I alluded to it earlier, but this is the biggest draft league we've had to date. As I will now move on to this next slide here, we have 18 teams in our main league and 14 in the beginners league, an astonishing 32 coaches, as a huge step up in participation. To that end, we have split up our league into 2 conferences, only fitting that the Wooper Club split up into the Johtonian and Paldean Woopers as our conferences. Steve, there were some tough decisions to make concerning the split up. Tell us a little bit about the season, scheduling, and all that comes with that.
So yeah, ending up with 18 kind of put us over that threshold we had drew at 16. After completing the draft, of course, I realized 16 may have been a lot to draft with. It would have got quite complicated towards the end. So kind of glad we made that threshold there and got past it. Splitting into 2 really helped with the power level. As a note, I kind of forgot about talking this with the rules. We're doing an untiered draft. We didn't do any tiering. We're just take whatever you want. So that's going to be fairly high powered. given what's available, and it'll give everyone a chance to try out as much of the new things as they please. But anyways, back to these tiers, these conferences. Now that we had 18 teams here, made sense to divide it into two, just trying to make equal conferences. The season will play out where you will play all other 8 coaches in your conference with a bye week at some point in there. And then for the playoffs, we'll take the top 4 from each conference. We'll play down to a conference champion, and the champions will play each other for the league champion.
And with that in mind, too, we are going to be splitting this breakdown up into 2 different videos, one covering each conference. Check the title for the one we're about to go through now, and check the description for a link to the other conferences draft. You see the coaches, the teams up here right now, so go to the one that you're most interested in watching. We already know this will be a long one, so with that, let's jump into the draft. Starting off the Johto Conference, we have Matt and the Cincinnati Incineroar looking for their comeback season. I think he might have the team for that, too. His first overall pick was Palafin, which cannot terrestrialize, followed by Garganacci, Meowscarada, Ceruledge, Pawmot, Donphan, Espathra, Sylveon, Orthworm, Fortress, and finally Rabsca to round out the team there. The first thing that stands out to me are the incredible number of new mons and gimmicks on his team, by which I mean Palafin is just a strange gimmick we've never seen before. He's got Pawmot and Rabsca on the team, which I'm sure we'll talk about their shenanigans there. Orthworm doesn't have Shed-Tail, but I usually think of that plus the strange Earth Eater. Garganacci is a wall, unlike anything we've ever seen before. It's just a number of strange mons on top of each other. Something else interesting, he's got a lot of physical attackers, which I know Steve will get into in a moment here too. Each of his first 6 draft picks have a base attack greater than 100, so I feel a little bit of concern potentially about how samey much of his draft may feel. There's still, I think, a bit to be said for the top of the draft at least. Look at those first few mons there. The Palafin, Garganacci, Meowscarada definitely all feel like mons that can and should come every single week, especially with Palafin and Meowscarada being both fast pivots with decent defensive versatility actually due to their typing, and able to flex in and out of other tanky mons like that Garganacci. Steve, tell us a bit more about the stats and typings.
So yeah, looking at the Incineroar's team here, they have weaknesses to Bug, Dark, Fire, and Ghost, all those being the worst in the league, as well as Water, with best in conference matchups against Dragon, Ice, Normal, Psychic, and Rock. Just isolating that to their first 6 picks, the Bug and Water weaknesses are still there, as well as additional weaknesses to Fairy, Fighting, Ground, Ice, and Grass. So lots of options here to kind of hit this team super effectively. One thing worth noting about this team also is although their Dragon matchup is pretty good with 2 Steel types and a Fairy type, those were all later round picks. Their first 7 picks all have no Dragon weakness or resistance. So Dragon might be a pretty spammable option against the higher valued mons on this team. Looking at their base stats, they have the best in-conference defense stat, averaging 9 points over the average. That is led by monsters such as Orthworm, Fortress, and Garganacci. They also have in the top 3 in terms of their attack stat, of course, as you would guess based on what Nate just mentioned, led by the Palafin hero, the Ceruledge, and Donphan. Their stats do have some weaknesses. The special defense is bottom 3 in their conference with 5 mons less than 70, and they are also in the bottom 3 in terms of speed with 6 mons less than 70. Also of note, although their average special attack is okay for the league, they don't really have any strong special attackers, with the best one being Rabsca at 115. So special attackers may be an issue for this team to use. Looking at their speed tiers, they go all the way from Meowscarada at the top to 123, all the way down to Garganacci at 35. There are a couple gaps greater than 15 throughout the speed tiers. Meowscarada at 123 down to Pawmot or Espathra at 105 presents a little bit of a gap. And then Palafin at 100 down to Ceruledge at 85 is right around the edge of what we'd call a gap at 15 there, as well as then Ceruledge at 85 down to Orthworm at 65. So a couple of gaps throughout, giving the opponent some additional space to speed creep and have additional bulk investment. But outside of that, a fantastic speed range, getting up to 123 down to 35, definitely presenting difficult options for the opponent speed creeping throughout the spectrum. Michael, how are the move selections looking for the Incineroar?
They're looking pretty good. Let's start off looking at their priority options to kind of go with some of those speed stats. Ceruledge has Shadow Sneak, which is great. Donphan has its Ice Shard still. Meowscarada can run Stab, Sucker Punch. Of course, Palafin has its signature Jet Punch. Palmot's got that Mach Punch and Fake Out, and even Sylveon could run a cheeky Pixelate Quick Attack if it wanted. So they've got plenty of priority options, but what I really like are their hazard setters. They have 4 rock setters, 3 spikes setters, and 2 toxic spikes setters, which is just absolutely fantastic. I think removal is at a premium this gen, so having so many ways to set up hazards that are just going to be such a big pain for your opponent is great. Speaking of, their removal options aren't nearly as good. They have Donphan and Fortress as spinners, and well, I think both are perfectly fine Pokemon. Fortress has definitely been coming into its own some this generation. Neither of them are exceptional, so they might struggle to remove hazards in some matchups, but they've got options. Going on to their pivot options, we see that Spathra, Fortress, Meowscarada, Palafin, and Palmot all have offensive pivot moves, so they've really got tons of options, mostly probably going to be looking at, Volt Switch on Palmot, Flip Turn on Palafin, and U-Turn on Meowscarada. So they've got plenty of ways to switch around between their offensive and defensive Pokemon. Speaking of defensive, they have 5 Mons that learn dual screens, most notably Fortress, Rabsca, and Sylveon, so you could see them using some of those to bulk up their team further later on. Wish on Palmot and Sylveon, and both Revival Blessings users means that, in coordination with that, their team is going to be sticking around for a long, long time. We are looking now at Knockoff, not nearly as widely distributed this gen as it had been. They've got Donphan, and Meowscarada is an excellent, excellent Knockoff user. Meowscarada also one of their 3 taunt users, which is nice as a fast taunter. They've got some okay status options, Will-O-Wisp from Ceruledge, Paralysis options on Fortress and Palmot, and Leech Seed on Meowscarada if they wanted to get cheeky to improve some of the bulk of their Pokemon further that way. And then we get to their boosters, which they have some very impressive mons here. I really like Swords Dance, Bulk Up, and Flame Charge options on Ceruledge, paired with its signature Bitter Blade, which is basically Fire-type Drain Punch. It can get scary very fast. Donphan can run Iron Defense Body Press if it wants to. Spathra, of course, is going to be running its Speed Boost, Calm Mind, Stored Power gimmick, which can just run away with the game so fast if a team is not prepared for it. Fortress, Garganacci, and Orthworm can also run Iron Defense Body as shenanigans. Palafin loves to bulk up and throw off those huge jet punches. Palmot can also run bulk up if it wants. Rabsca, surprisingly can get and run a Calm Mind, Cosmic Power, Stored Power set. So maybe we'll see the Revival Blessing user try to do a little bit of something before it just brings something back. And of course, Sylveon can run with Calm Mind as well. The only other moves to note here are signature moves, Salt Cure on the Garganacci, doing incredible passive damage, especially on those steel and water types, traditionally such great defensive types that I think we'll see more of as people Terra into them as defensive options. And of course, Flower Trick on Meowscarada can run a terrifying Overgrow Flower Trick with those guaranteed critical hits doing crazy damage. Nate, what are you looking at for the Terra options here?
Yeah, Palafin is unable to Terra in our league here, but as you just mentioned with the Meowscarada, maybe not something you'd look at immediately due to protein, but it does have the possibility to boost those flower tricks even further with a Terra Grass set, or even something cheeky like Terra Dark if you really want to be spamming those knockoffs. Otherwise, too, there are actually few options that may not really come up all that much. Donphan doesn't really take too big advantage of that, maybe a little more power behind the ground moves, but doesn't really want to do that too much. Orthworm and Fortress maybe want to get some stab fighting, but their steel types should probably already present the best option there as well. One of the options I really like is Sylveon, which can maybe Terra Fairy for a little bit more power there too. Also really like the Terra Fire option, a different defensive look for it for sure, while also giving it stab to something it already has with Mystical Fire, which is really neat there. A Spathra may be one of the better candidates here as well. It wants that extra type coverage aside from Psychic. It's known for spamming the Psychic moves. It's got to break through things somehow. Otherwise, we know it gets Dazzling Gleam, and it may be able to get stabbed stab on that, or a different option potentially to get through other dark types, just depending. Garganachi obviously wants to go into something defensive for its Terra. Something like Grass or Ghost or Water or Steel or even Fairy are all very interesting options, just depending on the team composition that it's facing and maybe something that you're looking to Terra into going into the battle itself. Ledge can also go into something interesting, something like Fairy fighting, or even we've seen a little bit of Bug to take care of some of the obvious weaknesses coming its way while still taking advantage of Flash Fire. And maybe my favorite one here, Palmot, has the ability to spam Double Shock just a little bit more here. Of course, its signature move makes it lose the electric typing, but if you then Terra into it, you're going to get that typing back, and you can spam Double Shock much more frequently, a little bit better than you would be otherwise. So overall, it seems a little, I don't know, sort of predictable all the way around. It's a little tough to say that it's too predictable with some of the interesting options we have. Palafin, of course, can run a bunch of different sets, and things like Garganachi Fortress may be tough to break through, but if you know it's coming, you may be able to find a way there. I'm interested to see if Matt will get creative, maybe try to find some ways to catch his opportunities, or his opponents off guard, find some opportunities there. I think it's overall a solid team. May need to make a couple moves at the bottom, but we'll see what he ends up going with. What are you seeing here, Steve?
I really think the Incineroar success this season is going to be based on their famous long battles, outlasting their opponents with all the support and cleric options they have, using hazards as best they can to wear down an opponent, the Salt Cure on Garganachi. It's all going to add up to very long, drawn-out games where they hopefully come out on top. What are your thoughts on their team and season looking forward, Michael?
Yeah, I think you guys have got it right. Their team is a little bit predictable. You know, Palafin and Espathra really just kind of do their thing, and they're very good things, but they're fairly straightforward. But with those Revival Blessing users, with some wishes, with that amazingly defensive Garganachi, I think, you know, they've got a good shot at just wearing down and breaking through a lot of opponents this season. What is up next, Nate?
Well, next up are Dash Dude's Lorain Lairon with a team starting with their first round pick Chi Yu, which also cannot Terra. Then come Glamora, Quaquavel, Dondozo, Bronzong, Iron Hands, Staraptor, Crocodile, Arcanine, Hippowdon, and Poltegeist at the end. This team is slow and strong, an average attack over 100, but no mons faster than base 100. Steve will go into a little more detail there in a bit. I do think the top four here all go together pretty decently, actually. With a couple special attackers at the top, a physical attacker, two hazard removers, plus one of the greatest tanks in the game. This seems kind of like the team in a nutshell at its best, forcing switches through the power of things like Chi-Yu or the inability to break things like Dondozo and punishing them all along the way with maybe the best hazard setter in the game here with Glamora, and it's several opportunities to set those up. Steve, tell us about those stats that seem very one-sided as well as the typings.
Yes, for the Lairon, getting started with the typing. Looking at their full team, they have weaknesses to Fairy, Ground, as well as worst in conference matchups against Water and Grass. Looking at the full team, of course, they have the best in conference matchups against Poison, Rock, Steel, and Fire. If you take a quick look at just their top 6 picks, the ones they're most likely to bring the most, they have the same 4 weaknesses, but additional weaknesses to Electric, Psychic, and Fighting. Some additional issues potentially with their type matchups is they only have one resist to Dragon, being Bronzong, and only one resist, or in this case, immunity to fighting in Poltegeist. Although neither of the options are particularly good against the team, with Dragon having no super effective targets and fighting only having 2, they're very spammable options as a potential Terra user or even just a normal Stabmon to just tear through the team with such limited resist options. Looking at their base stats, as mentioned, they have the best in-conference average attack stat at 6 over the average, led, of course, by Quaquavel, Iron Hands, and Staraptor. They also have top 3 in terms of their HP, with monsters like Dondozo, Iron Hands, and Hippowdon really helping there, as well as top 3 in defense, with, again, Dondozo, Bronzong, and Hippowdon. And one more thing, as you mentioned with their big special attacks at the top, they're also top 3 with their special attackers. Chi-Yu, Glamora, and Poltegeist all helping out there. And, of course, the kind of big elephant here is the speed. They are bottom 3, of course, here. 4 mons under 70, as well as nothing above 100 base. Speed tiers, of course, going from 33 at Bronzong at the bottom to both Chi-Yu and Staraptor at 100 at the top. a very limited top speed, which will frequently leave them outsped and outpositioned. It will require careful planning in order to mitigate this, as well as the additional health and bulk they have to survive those attacks. Throughout their speed tiers, they do have a couple of breaks as well, even though they have kind of a more limited range. Quaquaval at 85 down to Poltegeist at 70 is a little bit of a gap, as well as Poltegeist down to Iron Hands at 50. So the whole kind of middle of their speed tiers are a little broken up, but they're pretty thoroughly spread out in the bottom and in that 85 to 100 mark. So lots of options there, but outside of that, looking for a little bit of help in the speed department. Michael, how about the move sets for these Pokemon?
Yeah, we'd love to see some nice priority options from this team to complement some of those lackluster speeds, but unfortunately they don't have a ton. Arcanine, of course, gets great extreme speed. Iron Hands has Fake Out, Quaquaval has Aqua Jet, and Staraptor, which could be running like a band, could have decent quick attacks, but that's about it. They are looking better on the hazard side, though, with 3 rockers, one of which being that Glamora, who also gets spikes and toxic spikes, and with its toxic debris ability can set up more toxic spikes that way, so they do have plenty of hazard options. As far as removal go, though, they have decent options. I just think they might be a little awkward to use. Glamora, of course, gets the new Mortal Spin, which is a poison-type move that gets rid of hazards and poisons the opponent, but you want Glamora to be taking hits to use that toxic debris ability, and of course it being a poison move means it can be blocked by steel types. Quaquaval also gets Rapid Spin, which is great, but as a premier offensive piece here, it might not always feel comfortable running it. So they have options, but they could be a little bit awkward. They don't have a ton of pivot options either. Iron Hands gets a Volt Switch, and Quaquaval and Staraptor both get U-Turn, but that's about it. They do have some dual screens users, notably Bronzong and also potentially Glamora, as it's trying to sit in there and get hits to set up toxic spikes. They don't have any wish passing options, however, and they don't have any knockoff users as well. So also their only taunt users are Chi-Yu, Quaquaval, and Crocodile, who might not always want to run it or stay in to click it. They do have some okay status options, though. They have great Wisp users, Arcanine, Chi-Yu, and Poltegeist. Glamora gets Toxic, but they have no paralysis options, again, to try and help them with those awkward speeds. For boosting, they do have, though, Nasty Plot and Flame Charge options on Chi-Yu, which can let it absolutely tear through a team if it is able to get those up. Bronzong has plenty of options, Calm Mind, Iron Defense, Stored Power, Body Press. Dondozo loves to run Curse with the option for Body Press as well. Iron Hands, of course, is famous in those terror raids for using Belly Drum to get huge drain punches and just not die while it kills everything else. Crocodile has its Bulk Up and Moxie shenanigans as usual. Poltegeist, of course, has Shell Smash, and Quaquaval, I think, is most interesting with Sword Stance, Bulk Up, its signature Aqua Step, and the Moxie ability to actually be a pretty quickly snowballing Mon. Nate, what are you looking at as far as Terra options here?
Yeah, I've got some pretty interesting options for sure. The Glamora often likes to go something like Flying to shed its ground weakness, but could also do something like Terra Grass as well for a stronger energy ball while still resisting ground. Quaquaval probably wants Water to buff its stab signature move, but wouldn't mind another coverage option either, something like Electric potentially to break through those other water types. Dondozo doesn't need to Terra, but he definitely can, depending on matchup, to be even more unbearable to break through with something else, another defensive steel type, something like Steel, Fairy, or maybe even Dragon, which resists both of the stab moves that would be coming its way. Iron Hands can become very bulky with a matchup dependent Terra. Maybe something like Flying would be kind of neat, or even gain Stab on any coverage option. Something like Stab Earthquake would be really nice, or even just boost its current power on something like Electric moves. Staraptor would love to get Stab on close combat or power up the Brave Bird even further, as well as potentially power up that Quick Attack, as we did mention before that they're lacking a little bit in options for priority. Crocodile probably just going to go ground for a stronger Earthquake, but can get Stab on another coverage option, especially now that it lacks knockoff. It would really like a little more versatility with something like that. Arcanine could definitely work with another defensive typing. Something like Fairy may help a lot, but it may also just want to go boost the power of Extreme Speed by going normal. Hippo may like another defensive typing, some like Water, Steel, even Rock actually, to get a special defense boost from its own Sandstorm that it sets up. And of course, Poltegeist would appreciate having another coverage move in that fourth slot to take advantage of Shell Smash. Overall, there are some very individually very good pieces on this team that I think can win games against underprepared teams, but could use maybe a little bit more work to grab some more synergy and take pressure off of some of the other superstars trying to carry the load each week. Again, there are a couple synergies. We see what the top of the team here can do in terms of picks. We even see something like a potential Trick Room coming around here, but I'm not sure it all comes together or not. Steve, what does this team need to do?
I agree with your assessment here. This team really needs to figure out its identity and uh, be built in a way to work towards what it can do. With its slower speed, it really needs to either play super hard into that identity or make some free agency transactions to alleviate that issue and give them alternative ways to play and win the game. Otherwise, it'll just be send out the big bulky guys, hit hard, and hopefully you're still alive long enough to keep hitting them. Michael, what are your thoughts on the team?
Yeah, I think it's going to be all about positioning for this team because a lot of its threats, aren't particularly fast, and a lot of them also would enjoy setting up. So, can you find the positioning to let that happen, or are you just kind of in an awkward slugfest with your opponent where the kind of lack of speed, lack of versatility options might really hamper you? So I think they've got some great pieces here. It just might be awkward to put it all together. Who is up next for us to look at, though?
The next team is Adam's Pidgey Emporium, who took a surprise Annihilate third overall, followed up by Corviknight, Volcarona, Screamtail, Tyranitar, Rotom Mow, Haxorus, Toxapex, Weavile, Goodra, and Ditto in the last round. Bitter as I am that Screamtail went this early, look at how it supports each of the other top mons who all care about bulkiness. Annihilate wants to go both tanky and benefits from Wish support, but could also go offensive, while Volcarona is kind of the opposite. It wants to go offensive, but can definitely benefit from having Wish support to try its sweep again a second time later. And Corviknight is just the proper pivot here too, going between all these mons with relative ease while providing very reliable defog support for the Volcarona in particular, as well as others. Steve, tell us about the typings and stats.
Looking at the Emporium, the team has a couple of weaknesses. Worst in league matchup to fighting. They also have weaknesses to Fairy, Ice, Rock. They're also worse in the conference against Steel, although their Steel matchup isn't particularly bad. Just, the best chance for a Steel type to go off. Looking at their resistances, they don't have the best in conference matchup against any particular type. Just a overall fairly balanced type distribution. Looking specifically at their first 6 picks, they have the same weaknesses, but the additional fire, flying, water, ghost, and poison weaknesses. So lots of things there within the top 6 that the last 5 picks really helped solidify. Another potential issue is, or maybe not issue, just fact, is the fighting matchup doesn't quite look as bad as you would think. They, of course, have the 2 quad weaknesses in both Tyranitar and Weavile. However, of course, does Weevil really count, as you're not really counting it for bulk? And outside of that, many resists and just Tyranitar, which can be excellent despite that quad fighting weakness. Looking at the typing, they have the top in conference special defense, with Goodra and Toxapex leading the way, and that isn't even accounting for Tyranitar with its Sandstorm boosted special defense. They are top 3 in terms of their defense capabilities, with threats like Toxapex, Tyranitar, and even the Rotom in there to help out. However, they are in the bottom 3 in terms of HP, 3 under 70, although one of those is Ditto. The HP on Ditto does matter, but that's not really the selling point there. Additionally, they are bottom 3 in terms of special attack, where 7 of their 11 mons have under 70 base special attack. There are the dedicated special attackers, mons such as Volcarona and even Goodra as well. It's just lots of the other mons won't have that ability to threaten special moves if they want to try something mixed. They also are the bottom of conference in terms of their attack stat. 5 mons under 70, although they also have 5 mons at or above 100, so that really shouldn't be too much of an issue. Looking at their speed tiers at the top, they have Weavile at 125, going down to Toxapex at 35. And throughout their speed tiers, there are no significant gaps. Just going all the way through, everything looks good. No gaps greater than 15. So reasonably good speed tiers will force the opponent to actually invest in speed and not get away with any of that cheeky extra bulk, or even worse, a potential attack boosting nature instead of speed boosting. Michael, what are your thoughts on the move pools for these Pokemon?
Yeah, so they don't have really much in the way of priority. They have first impression on the Haxorus, which, is strong, but not the most reliable, as it can only work once each time it comes in. Weavile, of course, has Ice Shard, which is great, but that's it for their priority options. It's not a ton for them to work with there. Their hazards are okay. They've got 3 Rock Setters, as well as Toxic Spikes coming from that Toxapex. However, their only removal option is Corviknight. Corviknight is a great removal option, but only having the one could be awkward in some matchups. They have U-Turn on Annihilate, Corviknight, and Volcarona, as well as Baton Pass on Screamtail, which might be using it to pass around Wishes. So they've got some pivot options, but again, not great there. Screamtail is a pretty good dual screen option, though, to help shore up the bulk of the team, and Corviknight also gets dual screens, so maybe in 1 or 2 matchups it could run a cheeky screen here or there. Already mentioned Great Wishes coming from that Screamtail. However, they have no knockoff options anywhere on their team. Taunt, they've got 5 Taunt users, which is pretty good. And as far as status spreading, they've got Thunder Wave from Screamtail and T-Tar, Toxic on Toxapex, and Will-O-Wisp from Volcarona. So a range of options, but not the deepest status spreaders either. As far as boosting, though, they have that Annihilate, which does love to use Bulk Up, accrue those hits to boost up Rage Fist, and just absolutely go to town on absolutely anything. Corviknight can also run its Bulk Up and Iron Defense Body Press sets. Haxorus gets Swords Dance and Dragon Dance to further boost that monstrous attack of it. Screamtail could run Calm Mind, Amnesia, or Stored Power to have a funny offensive set, but it's generally going to be a more supportive option. T-Tar can run Dragon Dance, or even an Iron Defense Body Press set if it wants to. Volcarona, of course, loves its Quiver Dancing capabilities, and Weavile loves its Swords Dances as well if it can stick around to get them up. Nate, what are you seeing for Terra options here?
Yeah, I think there are a couple concerns about Terra options, but depending on how some of these sweepers do so, that Terra could win the game immediately. The couple that stand out offensively are the Volcarona or the Haxorus, for example. Getting up a Dance, for example, then using Terra and do something like Grass for Volcarona or Steel for Haxorus, respectively, to get up another Dance could just end the game right there, especially if the tanks have broken down the teams perfectly. Annihilate, of course, loves to use Terra and lets to take advantage of a move that can boost Rage Fist's power, which isn't too tough to do, honestly, with another defensive type, say something like Water or Fairy, so there's another great candidate. Most everything else here really does rely on its typing for synergy, so I'm feeling like it's a little limited in options here, but I'm a little scared for how beneficial they can actually be offensively. Maybe you can turn the tide here. Something like Corviknight could see a fire or electric attack incoming and Terra out of that into a resistance. T-Tar, actually some cool options with this as well. It could go something like flying to avoid an obvious fighting or ground move coming in. Rotom isn't something that likes to Terra too much, but it could just become a levitating electric or steel type, which is really cool. And steel type Toxapex sounds absolutely gross. The real wild card here is definitely Ditto. This is a thinker. Fairy is pretty safe, but you never know what type you need to be with Ditto. So that could be a whole nother mind game in the Ditto game itself. And something else kind of interesting here too, we do have a bit of a defensive core with the Corviknight and Toxapex, but I see no ground type here on the team at all. So it could be a dedicated Terra into ground for something here too to provide an electric immunity and at least provide a little bit there to stop an electric onslaught. Overall, I think the team has the ability to compete for a playoff spot here, but it may require a surprise sweep or two, a couple of frustrating wins here, with opponents being unable to break through the walls before bringing in those sweepers at the right times. Steve, what do you think?
Definitely agree there. I think Annihilate and Volcarona are going to be key to this team, both of them being able to set up on their respective sides and annihilate teams when their opportunity presents themselves, and the rest of the team every week is going to be dedicated to giving them their best opportunity to make that huge sweep to win the game. Michael, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the awkward thing I see with this team is its lack of immediate pressure. Sure, something like a Scarf Haxorus or maybe a Banded Weavile can put out that immediate pressure, but the lack of speed on many of their threats could make that a little awkward, which is why I love this Ditto so much. If so many of your threats are slower and want to set up, why not just steal your opponent's sweeper for yourself? It's pretty great on this team, and while I think it could be a little awkward to use, I can also see this team having a bit of success. Moving on, Nate, who is next?
Next up will be Zach's new look Summit County Psyducks, headed by his 4th overall pick of Iron Valiant. Past that are the deadly Baxcalibur, Scizor, Skeledirge, Mousehold, Quagsire, Sandy Shocks, Gyarados, Rotom Fan, Dunsparce, and Toedscruel. A lot of Mimi picks throughout, very funny. This means Zach is going to have to make some very smart switches into those recover walls and may need to use Terra smartly too to capitalize on his opportunities. I'll focus on the top 3 first. Iron Valiant, Baxcalibur, and Scizor are all offensive behemoths that can either set up or attack straight up, and Baxcalibur and Scizor have the bulkiness to live a hit or two in the meantime. Meanwhile, 2 Skeledirge and Quagsire stand out to me as 2 unaware walls that both have actual recovery to help pivot in and out for those powerhouses. And that means that, Steve, what are we looking at for types and stats?
Looking at the typings for the Psyducks, their team has a couple weaknesses: fire, grass, ice, rock, and they also have the worst in-league matchup against Psychic. Although it's still fine, they just have the one weakness to Psychic in Iron Valiant, and only one resist in Scizor, otherwise hitting them neutrally. So pretty spammable type, but all in all, not a huge issue. Looking at their resists for the full team, they aren't the best in conference in anything. So they have kind of a smaller list of weaknesses, but also nothing they're the best at defending against. Specifically focusing on the first 6 Pokemon, they have the same weaknesses to fire, grass, and rock, but they're also adding to that fairy, flying, ground, and then worse in conference matchups to dark and steel, but again, those aren't being too bad. And they do have the best matchup against electric in terms of their first 6. In addition to only having the one psychic resist, they also only have the one dark resist in Iron Valiant. As a good news, that will always be coming, but especially with this generation's influx of powerful dark type mons, that'll definitely be something that the Psyducks really need to watch out for, is keeping Iron Valiant as healthy as possible to take those attacks. And as Nate mentioned, Iron Valiant isn't necessarily the most bulky of mons, so it could quite easily get worn down, opening the team to a flooding of dark type attacks, even for just neutral damage. Looking at the base stat totals, the Psyducks are in the top 3 in terms of HP, that being led by Dunsparce, Baxcalibur, and Skeledirge, and they're in the top 3 in terms of their attack stat, really led by their first 3 picks, Baxcalibur, Iron Valiant, and Scizor, as well as Gyarados helping out a lot too at base 125. They are also, funnily enough, in the top 3 in terms of their special defense, while being under the average in the league. That's just how high up some of these other teams have their special defense. But for special defense, the notable mons they have are Toedscruel and Rotom Fan. Taking a look at their speed tiers, they go from 35 with Quagsire at the bottom up to 116 with Iron Valiant at the top. There are a couple of speed breaks in the middle. Gyarados at 81 to Skeledirge at 66, as well as the Dunsparce at 55 to Quagsire at 35. The Dunsparce to Quagsire gap isn't something I am particularly concerned about. You're not too worried about speed at that range. And the Gyarados Skeledirge isn't a massive issue, but it will open up the doors for some of those slower mons to just not bother investing in speed. One additional note with the speed tiers is that Iron Valiant is their fastest mon at 116, which is a little bit low for a top end. We generally like to see something in the 120s. So the team will be susceptible to some of those faster mons just running over the entire team if they aren't able to be stopped by any of the many defensive pieces on the Psyducks. Michael, how are the moves looking for these Pokemon?
They've got some interesting options here. As far as priority goes, they've got monstrously powerful Ice Shards coming from Baxcalibur and Bullet Punches coming from Scizor, as well as a Shadow Sneak option on Iron Valiant. So not plentiful, but very good priority options there. Their hazards look fantastic with 3 Rockers, 3 Spikers, and 2 Toxic Spikers. Then looking at their removal, they've got Defog on Scizor, Rapid Spin on Toedscruel, and of course Mousehold's signature Tidy Up, which is Dragon Dance and removal in one move. because sure, why not? Put all those effects together. They don't have the most pivoting potential. They've got U-turn on Mousehold and Scissor, as well as Volt Switch on Sandy Shocks. Looking at their potential to run screens for more bulk on the team, they have dual screens options on Iron Valiant and Toadscruel, but I really like the option for screens on Sandy Shocks, having a somewhat limited move pool itself, running, just like dual stabs and then a cheeky screen and something else, I think could be very nice. They don't have any wish passing options here for recovery between team members, and their only item removal options are knockoff from Iron Valiant and Toadscruel, which are, in my opinion, actually very good knockoff users. They've got 4 taunt users, notably Iron Valiant and Mousehold as nice fast taunters, and then we get to their options for spreading status, and they have so many options. They've got Paralysis coming from the Dunsparce, from the Gyarados, from the Iron Valiant, from Mousehold, from Sandy Shocks. They've got Will-O-Wisp on Skeledirge, Toxic on Quagsire and Toadscruel, and of course Toadscruel also has Spore and Leech Seed, and with its signature ability can even status things that their abilities would prevent them from being statused. Looking on to their big boosting threats, Baxcalibur is of course the stand-up in my opinion. Swords Dance and Dragon Dance options with Icicle Spear and a potential loaded dice to make that effectively a minimum base 100 ice type move, and its signature Glaive Rush, which is it's a base 120 power dragon type move that you take double damage next turn, but you don't take any damage if you just keep KOing the opponent before they attack. Mousehold can run Tidy Up, as I mentioned, with its signature Population Bomb for huge damage. Just needs to watch out for any potential Rocky Helmets. The Dunsparce I have had success with in some random battles with the ability to run Calm Mind and Stored Power, as well as getting now Stab Boom Burst on those Calm Minds. Gyarados, of course, has its Dragon Dance and Moxie options. Quagsire can run Amnesia or Curse to be even bulkier. Sandy Shocks could run Iron Defense and Body Press if it wanted, but I doubt it will. More likely to run that would be something like Iron Defense on Scizor, who of course can also run Swords Dance, and Skeledirge, with its signature Torch Song, as well as access to Flame Charge, can really snowball and really set itself up to just clean easily at the end of a game. Nate, what are you thinking of as far as this team's Terra options?
And if we look at how many setup options there are, you can see why, even if Iron Valiant itself cannot Terra, I do find this one of the scarier Terra teams in the league. It really starts, though, with that Baxcalibur. We talked about it a little bit, becoming maybe the best mon in the draft once we voted against banning Terra on it, with Ice or Dragon for stabs, or even something like Ground to give it stab on a whole other move like Earthquake too. It can win by itself if it picks the proper Terra type. Whenever you think of Terra 2, you may think immediately of something like Scissor's Bullet Punch. It really stands out. Essentially the strongest consistent priority minus E-Speed on a great defensive typing too. Skeledirge obviously has plenty of defensive options too. It primarily likes to go something like potentially Fairy or even Water to stall out just about anything while boosting up with that Torch Song. Past that, Mousehold goes normal for even more power on Population Bomb without needing to set up at all. Quagsire also could potentially go into a defensive typing, something like Steel, Poison, or even Ghost if it wants to stick around and just set up hazards in front of things. Sandy Shocks probably wants a little bit more power, likes going to Electric, or it also would like some coverage moves, maybe something like Ice so we can get that Bolt Beam coverage, both of them with Stab. Gyarados would love to go Ground for Earthquake Stab too, or even just Flying to actually get a reliable stab on the flying side for about the first time with Terra Blast. And finally, the other big standout to me, Rotom Fan can actually take advantage of Levitate finally, going Terra Electric or Ice for another Electric Ice user. I think the only problem here is having too many incredible options with only one per battle, but that's a pretty great problem to have considering none of them are necessary, I think, in any individual match. They have a lot of different options with Terra. It is overall a very strong team. If he takes advantage of his positioning properly, as he said, there's not much pivoting, but if you make smart switches here, I think we could be in for a surprise. Steve, what do you see with the team?
For the team this season, I think the success will ride on those first 3 picks, the offensive trio, as well as the Fairy Dragon Steel Core of Iron Valiant, Excalibur, and Scizor. The success for the team will just be based on if these 3 mons can carry as we expect they will. Michael, what about you?
Yeah, no, I really like this team. I love Iron Valiant, who I even completely skipped over all of the setup options it has. But look, all it needs is to run choice specs and just murder everything, anyways. But like Nate said, there's so many good Terra options, and I think that's going to be something that we're going to see as a bit of an advanced play as the season advances. Like, you can bring great Terra options on all of your Mons, and then you just use whichever one looks best at any given point in the match. And just having all of those options to you is going to be so great. Who do we have up next, Nate?
The mighty Miltanks had a crazy start to the draft, grabbing a Roaring Moon, a Hydreigon, then Low Kicks to start, followed by Rotom, Wash, Amoonguss, Mimikyu, Arbolifa, Paldean Tauros, Fire Form, Dugtrio, Kilowattrel, and Cloth. Three dark types at the start have obvious consequences Steve will talk about in just a little bit. But we do need to acknowledge, too, that Roaring Moon on the physical side, Hydreigon on the special side, they both provide pretty nice setup there, and with speed coming from the Low Kicks First Impression and Sucker Punch, that's actually pretty impressive. Plenty of momentum too at the top to go into things like that Dugtrio to handle Dark Resist. There are a few really cool things about this team. But Steve, of course, tell us about the typings.
So, as you mentioned, the typings for this team are a little suspect. The multiple dark types really show in the type matchups, with a team having weaknesses to bug, fighting, flying, rock, worst in league matchups to fairy and ice, and then worst in league matchups, but not terrible matchups when you look at them for dragon and poison. The similar typing does grant some common resist, which really help in the best in conference resist to dark, electric, ghost, and ground. If you limit the selection to the first 6 mons, again, we have those 3 dark types, so a lot of those weaknesses carry over. Really everything but the fighting. Funnily enough, there picks other mons in the beginning. Low Kicks, of course, not having the fighting weakness with its dual bug, and then Amoonguss and Mimikyu kind of tempering down that fighting weakness within the top 6. Some other potential issues with the typing for this team. They have only one dragon, fairy, and rock resist or immunity for all 3 of those. They aren't overly weak to any of those types, although I guess fairy with the 2 quads is pretty close to pretty overly weak. But just that one resist getting overrun could lead to a field day for a strong stab attacker on any of those types. So definitely going to have to prioritize keeping those resist or immunities healthy and safe. Moving on to look at the base stats, the Miltanks are in the top 3 in the conference in terms of their speed, being led by mons such as Kilowattrel, Dugtrio, and Roaring Moon. However, they do have some poor stats otherwise. Bottom 3 in terms of defense within the league, 2 mons under 70. There's no real particular defensive standouts, the best one being Cloth at 115, but otherwise just a bunch of middling defense that led to a low defense for the league. Additionally, a bottom 3 special attack with 6 mons under 70, and they also are the bottom of conference in terms of HP with 3 mons under 70, and in general they're just poor stats, 70s around. Looking at the speed tiers for the Miltanks, they have a low end of 30 with Amoonguss up to Kilowattrel at 125 for the high end. Going through their speed tiers, they have a couple of breaks. Roaring Moon at 119 down to Tauros Blaze at 100. A pretty big gap there, especially in kind of the very competitive speed area, as well as a speed gap from Cloth at 75 down to Arboliva at 39. That one's not such a big deal, but still allows those slower mons the chance to not need to invest. Michael, what are the move sets looking like for these Pokemon?
Yeah, Nate, you already mentioned Low Kicks is a priority monster with Tinted Lens being able to make huge first impressions and Sucker Punches even more devastating. Mimikyu, of course, also loves to run Shadow Sneak, and Dugtrio can run Sucker Punch if you want to try and trap and KO something like a particularly fast Scarfer on the other side. Their hazards, however, don't look great. They've got Rocks on Dugtrio, Hydreigon, and Cloth. Hydreigon's probably the most reliable of those, and I'm not sure if you really want to be running rocks on it week to week. Then we get to the removal options. and we're done with their removal options. They have absolutely no hazard removers on their entire team, which could be a big problem for them throughout the season. Looking at their pivot options, we're starting to get better. They've got U-Turn on 4 Mons and Volt Switch on Kilowattrel as well, who learns Volt Switch and U-Turn, you know? Run whichever you want to run. Ground types aren't real. Screens options, they've got dual screens coming from Arboliva, which, you know, as a bulky Mon, could certainly find room to run those at some point. No Wish Passers, however, and the only knockoff user they have on their team is Cloth. However, they do have 4 great taunters in Hydreigon, Lokix, Mimikyu, and Roaring Moon, and they have some very good stats options as well. The Paralysis coming from Hydreigon, Kilowattrel, and Mimikyu, Will-O-Wisp from Tauros, Toxic and Spore from Amoonguss, and Leech Seed coming from Arboliva. As far as their boosting options go, Hydreigon can run Dragon Dance, but it more frequently is going to be running Nasty Plot if it wants to set up. Cloth can run Swords Dance along with its signature Anger Shell ability to be a pretty unassuming Mon that gets scary very fast. Lokix can run Swords Dance and Agility to make it a terrifying sweeper. Mimikyu, of course, gets Swords Dance and Bulk Up that it likes to run. Roaring Moon has Dragon Dance to become absolutely terrifying with a booster too. And then, perhaps my favorite, the Paldean Tauros gets Bulk Up to boost Stab Body Press on already good defensive stats, and Flame Charge as well, to get Stab on to then outspeed things. And of course it has its signature Raging Bull attack, which was a base 90 power fire attack for it that destroys screens as well. So you've got a good good physical fire stab that you don't have to rely to taking all of that Flare Blitz recoil. Nate, what are you seeing as far as Terra on this team?
So Roaring Moon cannot terrestrialize in our league here, but Hydreigon sure can, and that is maybe one of the better Terra users. It takes advantage of Levitate incredibly well. Got some cool typings you could go into, things like Fire or Steel, even something like Electric, which we talked about with those Levitators, or even Poison to potentially resist a couple of those interesting typings there too. Not to mention, of course, Fairy or Ice if you wanted some more coverage on that Hydreigon. Lokix probably wants to go one of its stab moves, get a little bit more power on that first impression, as if you needed any more, or the Sucker Punch. Rotom probably doesn't need Terra, but it could definitely go Electric, as we already mentioned. A Levitating Electric type, really good, get extra stab, and eliminate a Grass weakness. Amoonguss would have quite a few cool options, but as we talked about with the typings, there are quite a few weaknesses that have accumulated over the course of the team, and Amoonguss's typing itself seems, I think, a little too important with the team composition to change away from, so I think that probably is something that has to stay put. Mimikyu likes a little bit more power on its stabs, as well as maybe another offensive option. I really like the idea of being able to go grass to get stab onto the wood hammer option that it already has. Arboliva is actually strangely really good Terra candidate too, especially if we can go something like Steel and then lose its Earthquake weakness because of the grassy terrain that it has the ability to set. A better defensive typing can go a long way with those cool stats. Blaze Tauros could definitely work with another defensive typing as well to go with potentially Intimidate. I like the idea of something like Flying if you see a ground move incoming. And actually, my last big standout is that Dugtrio with the ability to go, say, something like Poison to be able to take out some of those fairy types and just get a little bit more coverage with Terra Blast to take out some other options that it could trap. Of course, you may just want to go ground to get extra power on that already powerful Earthquake, too. So overall, this looks like it's an awkward team to be sure, but if played smart, I think there are a few options here. I mentioned how key Amoonguss is in the game plan. Dugtrio being able to trap key options could be huge here too. You've got quite a few tools at your disposal. I think this team can still eke out some wins. What are you looking at with this team, Steve?
I would definitely agree with your assessment there. There are definitely some major threats on the team that cannot be overlooked. However, the way the threats work together may not be the best for the team and will require near perfect play to bring out their full potential. Michael, what are your thoughts on the team as a whole?
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, really, the defensive Pokemon here, particularly Amoonguss and Rotom Wash, are going to have to do a whole lot of heavy lifting, carrying those offensive threats on their back to give them the opportunities to set up and do damage. So I think, like you said, they've got the pieces, but it's going to take a lot of work to actually get them in the positions to put in the work that we know they can. What is our next team, Nate?
Next up, the Music City Mudkips are looking to make a splash in the main league. They've got Great Tusk at the top there, followed by Slowking, Iron Jugulus, King Gambit, Breloom, Tinkaton, Sea Titan, Armarouge, Alomomola, Clodsire, and Frostlass. Terrifying across the board, but there are, of course, a couple of synergies we have to look at immediately. We know that Slowking can set up the Sea Titan that was picked later on in the draft with Chilly Reception. Breloom and King Gambit supply some of the best priority available in the draft. Great Tusk supports threats like Iron Jugulus beautifully, and Alomomola Clodsire make for two of the biggest steals in the draft, especially that late, and especially when paired together to form a beastly physical and special defensive core. What do the typings and stats say about the team, Steve?
So for the Music City Mudkips, the team has some weaknesses to fairy, fighting, fire, ground, rock, and worst in league matchups to flying and ghost. Pair that also with the best in conference resist to water. However, if you isolate that to the first six, they only have the weaknesses, still the weaknesses to fairy, fighting, fire, and flying, and they add ice. Notably, though, within their top six, they are fantastic against Rock, have one of the best matchups in the league against Rock, with only one weakness within their top six. So overall, I would say that Rock weakness really is not much of an issue. It's all lower tier mons that the opponent should not be overly prepping for. Looking at the base stats, the Music City Mudkips have the top in conference HP, 21 points above the average. That, of course, being led by the monstrous Titan at 170, Alomomola at 165, and even Clodsire at a low 130. A massive pool of HP for this team that will surely help them throughout the season. However, to get all this HP, they did sacrifice some other stats. They are the bottom of the conference in terms of their special attack, with 6 mons under 70. Bottom of the conference in terms of special defense, with 4 mons under 70. And bottom of the conference in terms of speed, also with 4 mons under 70. And a high end that I'll talk about here in just a moment. Looking at their speed tiers, they have a low end of 20 with Clodsire, up to, at the high end, 110 with Frostlass. First, looking within that range for gaps, there are a couple gaps on the lower ends. Alomomola at 65 down to King Gambit at 50, and then Clodsire at 20. Those are some pretty big gaps, but under 65, I typically don't worry too much about. You're not too worried about speed at that tier anyway. And then the kind of biggest issue with the speeds of this team, of course, is their high end. Only having Frostlass at 110 as their fastest, nothing above that. You heard me earlier talking about how 116 wasn't fast enough, and 110 definitely isn't fast enough. Of note, though, is that is their last round pick. Looking above that, their fastest mon at 108 is Iron Jugulus. And, even that 108, we're still way too slow. Team can easily get outrun, and with their poor special attack, special defense, and speed, may take a lot of damage, but they have the HP to do it. So will the team end up succeeding with that? Michael, what are you thinking about the moves for the team?
Yeah, so they definitely have some nice options to try and mitigate that speed deficit. They've got Mach Punch coming from Breloom, which is great. Sucker Punch from King Gambit hits very hard. Titan and Frostlass both get Ice Shard as options. Tinkaton gets Fake Out, and Alomomola gets Aqua Jet if, I don't know, it was trying to pick off a very weak, I don't know, something that, like a Focus Ash or something. I don't know, it's there. Their hazard game looks very nice. They've got 4 rockers, 2 spikers, and a toxic spiker. The removal is only Great Tusk and it's Rapid Spin, but Great Tusk is one of, if not the best single hazard remover in the game right now. So really, I wouldn't say that's a weakness. For pivot options, you turn on Iron Jugulus, Chilly Reception on Slowking, which can set up Titan, and Baton Pass on Alomomola if it's trying to pass a wish off. Those are all decent options, but not particularly deep in that department. dual screens options on Tinkaton, Frostlass, and Armor Rouge, as well as Aurora Veil on Frostlass, are all actually some good options to further cement that bulk of the team and just make it absolutely impossible to break through. I already mentioned Wishes can come off of that huge HP stat of Alamamola. For item removal options, they've got knockoff on Great Tusk, Iron Jugulus, and Tinkaton, 3 great knockoff users. A good 5 taunt users. For status, they've got 4 Thunderwave users, Will-O-Wisp on Armor Rouge and Frostlass, Toxic on Clodsire and Breloom, as well as Spore and Leech Seed coming from that Breloom. For their boosting options, even though we've said this is mostly a kind of a bulky team, you've got Calm Mind and Flame Charge and Stored Power on Armor Rouge, which will probably like running Flash Fire to cover some of those fire weaknesses, but can also run Weak Armor as a setup option as in 2. Breloom can get Bulk Up or Sword Stance if it wants to be more offensive. Clodsire can get Amnesia and Curse if it wants to bulk up on any of its particular defenses. Great Tusk gets Bulk Up and Body Press, which can make it absolutely devastating. King Gambit's Supreme Overlord ability, of course, boosts it, but it also just gets straight up Sword Stance. Slowking gets a bevy of different setup options with Nasty Plot, Calm Mind, Iron Defense, Amnesia, Stored Power, all kinds of different things if you wanted a more defensive Slowking, offensive Slowking, whatever you want. And Tinkaton can boost its already huge Gigaton Hammer with Sword Stance. So they've got plenty of boosting options if they wanted to go that route. Nate, what are their different Terra options here?
Yeah, similarly, they do have a lot of really cool options. Great Tusk at the beginning, of course, always appreciates having more power on either of its 120 base power stab moves, one for each type, but also wouldn't mind the Terror into a defensive option. Remember that it is trying to get spins off most of the time, too. Soul King would love to get out of its mediocre typing, maybe even just going pure water, or even something like Fairy or Steel defensively. Iron Jugulus would, of course, get a bunch more power on some of the coverage options it has, maybe something like Ground or Steel, but may also just like the extra stab power with something like Choice Specs a little bit more. I think the same is probably true for King Gambit, who, of course, would appreciate extra power on something like Sucker Punch or the Kowtow Cleave, but may also want to go into a fighting resist, something like Flying or Ghost to bait a very predictable fighting move and set up or punish appropriately. Breloom is very good abuser here, with the extra power from Mach Punch from fighting potentially, but also wants the extra coverage afforded to it with Terra Fire, especially when you consider that Spore and Mach Punch are really the only mandatory moves, and the only monsters that are going to be immune to Spore for the most part are going to be weak to Fire as well. Tinkaton can get more power on Gigaton Hammers if it needed that, or get coverage, something like Electric or Fire for potential fellow Steel types, perhaps ones that it bullies in the Pokedex. See, Titan would love a little bit more power on Ice, and potentially could keep the Snow boost there too, but can also just grab something like Ground for extra stab moves options. Armor Rouge has a lot of interesting ideas. You can go something like Ground, even Bug or Steel to get a defensive profile boosted by Flash Fire, and even get a trigger of Weak Armor if that's the type that it's going for. A Fairy type Alomomola sounds gross. I want to barf just thinking about it. Clodsire could also go Fairy, or another defensive option, something like Steel. Even Frostlass here, I think, could go pure Ice to pair with Snow, or even Steel to get a couple more layers of spikes up with a better defensive profile. Overall, this is a pretty solid team with some pretty solid cores. We talked about some of the physical special there with Alomomola Clodsire, some of the power up top there too. I think it'll be tough to prepare for absolutely everything this team can do. Look for it to snag a couple of potentially very frustrating wins. What do you think, Steve?
I would agree. This team does look like a pain to face, especially just all of the HP this team has and the ability to wish pass and keep everything healthy and just keep hitting you. Although the base stats in some aspects leave some to be desired, they have the power where they need it to just keep hitting, keep wearing you down, and win the long war because they have the healing to support themselves through it. Michael, what are your thoughts on the team?
Yeah, they told me when the generation came out that Stall was dead, but I'm staring it in the face and I hate it. I've got 2 regenerators, an unaware wall, fantastic removal, Spore, Toxic, Leech Seed, huge wishes. This is just an absolutely obnoxious team to face, and really it's going to take some intense prep to really be able to confidently break through everything here without just getting chipped down into oblivion yourself. So let's get this horrifying team off of the screen, and please, Nate, who is up next?
I'm glad you asked because the last three here are definitely the top three coming into this draft, at least in terms of prior performance. We, of course, have to start with our guest here, the Route 1 Birbs, looking for the three-peat with the number 7 pick. Qian Pao somehow fell to 7th, but cannot Terra at least, and it's paired with the Iron Moth, Tinglu, Slowbro, Serena, Salamence, Magnezone, Hawlucha, Florges, Lucario, and Gardevoir. The top looks absolutely stacked. Qianpao and Tinglu may both be dark, but their weaknesses are pretty well covered by Iron Moth, and those that aren't satisfactorily covered are by Slowbro and Salamence. Reliable hazards facilitate Qianpao and Iron Moth, breaking the opponent down with plenty more coverage throughout, some extra speed and or special attacking covered later too. This may be one of the most complete drafts here in terms of having roles filled by amazing users in each role. Steve, what are you looking at with typing and stats?
Taking a look at the typing, although the team does seem to match pretty well, there are a lot of weaknesses on various mons that do add up when looking at the team holistically. The team has weaknesses to fairy, fighting, fire, flying, ice, rock, worst in league matchup against ground, and then worst in league matchup, but it's not really a terrible matchup against normal and poison. They do, however, for their efforts, have the best in conference matchup against dragon, likely due to those two fairies picked up in the 9th and 11th rounds. If you isolate that to the first 6 mons, they still have most of the same weaknesses with the exclusion of fire and the addition of bug, of course, as they have 4 bug weaknesses within the top 5. Notable, however, is they also within their first 6 have a slight dragon weakness, which a bunch of neutralities and Salamence weak and picking up all of their dragon resist at the end. So a strong dragon attacker may be able to abuse this team, getting through all of the larger threats at neutral, and then having to just mop up the lower picked threats with some sort of coverage move. Taking a look at the base stats, this team has the top in conference special attack, 17 points above the average. This is led by, of course, Iron Moth with its base 140, Magnezone, and Gardevoir. The team also is top 3 in terms of special defense, of course, being led by Florges with that massive special defense. Gardevoir and Iron Moth also there helping. Taking a look at the speed tiers, the Birbs go from Slowbro at 30 at the low end, all the way up to 135 with Qian Pao. This is a great spread there overall. There are a couple of gaps. From Qian Pao at 135 down to Hawlucha at 118 is a little bit of a big gap. However, Qian Pao is just so far ahead. This is probably okay. There, the base 120 mons get a little bit of speed creeping in, but it's not much, and there's not a ton of mons in that 120 to 135 range. The other speed gap is on the lower side. Magnezone at 60, down to Tinglu at 45, down to Slowbro at 30. These are all bigger gaps, but even going every 15 points in these lower speed tiers is probably good enough. So all in all, fantastic speed tiers with just a well-rounded statted team. Michael, what kind of move pools do your Pokemon have?
Yeah, this could be the weakness of the team. As far as priority goes, I've got huge Ice Shard and Sucker Punches coming from Qian Pao, but does it really need it? Then I've got E-Speed, Vacuum Wave, and Bullet Punch options on Lucario, and those are my only priority users. For hazards, I've got Toxic Spikes coming from Iron Moth and Rocks and Spikes on Tinglu, but those again are my only options. Removal, I've got Defog on Hawlucha and Rapid Spin on Serena, and that's it. For pivot options, I'm doing a bit better. I've got U-Turn on Hawlucha, Serena, and Iron Moth, and Volt Switch on Magnezone, as well as Baton Pass from Florges if it's trying to stay in and then pass off the Wish. For screens options, I've got Florges and Slowbro learning Light Screen, and then dual screen options on Magnezone, Gardevoir, and Serena. But, really those great users would be the Florges and the Slowbro, and they only learn Light Screen. Cleric, I do have huge wishes coming off of Florges and smaller wishes coming off of Gardevoir if I want to. Item removal, I've basically got none. Gardevoir learns knockoff technically, but do you run it on it? Probably not. I've got 5 Taunters, Qian Pao, Hawlucha, and Tinglu all being very nice, speedy or reliable ones. Then we get back to not so great status-wise. I've got Thunderwave on Gardevoir, Magnezone, and Slowbro, and Will-O-Wisp from Gardevoir, but that's about it. But then we get to my boosting options, which is where my team does significantly better. Qianpao gets Sword Stance to become even stronger. Well, it's got its huge speed stat. Florges can run Calm Mind and Stored Power with its huge bulk and resilience. Gardevoir can also run Calm Mind and Stored Power. Hawlucha, of course, gets Sword Stance and Bulk Up to go with its Unburden ability. Iron Moth gets Agility and Flame Charge as well as Fiery Dance as potential setup options for it. Lucario can set up specially or physically with Swords Dance, Bulk Up, Nasty Plot, Calm Mind, and Agility. Magnezone can get Iron Defense and Body Press if it so wishes. Salamence, of course, has Dragon Dance and its Moxie ability to become an absolutely terrifying late game sweeper. And then, similar to Slowking, Slowbro gets Nasty Plot, Calm Mind, Iron Defense, Amnesia, Stored Power, and unique to it over Slowking, Body Press, so it's got a ton of different options if it wants to go defensive or offensive, depending on how I'm feeling. Nate, how am I looking as far as Terra goes, though?
Well, luckily Qianpao cannot Terra, but it's a good thing that several other mons here can. Iron Moth stands out for sure, and so something that can Terra a few different ways before or after setup, including something like Fairy or Water for a defensive profile, or also, we've talked a little bit about it, Flying because of that giant ground weakness, which is pretty cool, or even Fire to boost that offense, or Grass to give Stab to a few more of its coverage options. Ting Lu definitely wants a defensive typing here. It's already pretty good, but in a pinch can go to something else, something like Fairy, Water, or even Steel are kind of neat options. Slowbro, we talked about Slowking a little bit before, how it wants to get away from the Psychic typing, which really doesn't do it too many favors, so Slowbro can easily find a defensive Terra typing as well, something like Steel. Serena also would appreciate something like Steel as well, something to help it spin a little bit more reliably if that's the job that it's coming for. Salamence also could go to Steel, help a lot with a lot of its weaknesses, as well as go for Flying for a little bit more power there. It does have dual wing beat, but it wants a little bit more power behind that, considering the giant attack stat it has. Magnezone can get a little bit more power, similarly with like how we talked about Dugtrio before. It would like to be able to get a little bit more damage to finish off those that it traps. It could even go something like Fairy a little bit better than others, since it is the one that threatens the steals, not the other way around. Hawlucha and Gardevoir, of course, like a little bit more power too. Lucario likes normal to boost extreme speed. But the notable one near the bottom of the draft for me is Florges, who can go to another ridiculous defensive typing. We have to mention Steel yet again, or even something like Water, and wall up on whatever it chooses using its deceptive bulk. Again, I think this is a overall pretty ridiculous team. I anticipate the top three bonds to always come, plus probably two of the next maybe three or so, and then one from the bottom. So if there's any weakness, it could be that there's a little predictability, but Michael as a coach will switch things up as well as anyone, so that probably doesn't even count either. What do you think, Steve?
This team looks fantastic. I really like the synergy of the top two, the Qianpao and Iron Moth, both of them being fast, powerful attackers on opposite sides of the attacking spectrum, able to break through really whatever the opponent sets up, followed up by a couple of walls to help pivot between them, and that's just the backbone of this fantastic team. Looks great. Hope has a wonderful season. Michael, what are you thinking about your team?
Yeah, I think this team looks really good. At least every mon individually is fantastic. I think this team is going to be a bit of a litmus test for the rest of the conference. Because, like you said, the predictability and lack of versatility we mentioned means it might fold pretty easily to a very well done Terra option from my opponent. But if you don't get that Terra right, it's going to be really hard to deal with, I think. So I'm looking forward to getting to use it. Hopefully I get comfortable with it faster than I did my team last season, although that worked out alright for me in the end. It's enough about me though. Nate, what about yourself?
Yeah, next up it is your Buffalo Bouffalant, starting off with my Goldango as my first round pick at 8th overall, into the Garchomp, Azumarill, Slitherwing, Talonflame, Gastrodon, Wo-Chien, Toxtricity, Lycanroc Dusk, Darkspun, and Cyclizar. I see not as much power as some drafts, not as much defense as some drafts, but the ability to go several different ways depending on the matchup and prep, and I think that is what the Bouffalant do better than just about anyone else. At the top, you've got Goldango with defensive or offensive sets. Same with Garchomp and its rough skin. Even Azu can rock an AV with the best of them. I think there's a lot of versatility at the top and plenty of potential throughout the rest of the draft. Steve, what do you see with typings and stats?
So starting with the typings for the Bouffalant, they have weaknesses to Fairy, Flying, Ground, Ice, Rock, and the worst in conference, but still okay matchups against Poison and Psychic. Also within the full team, they have the best matchup in the conference against Water. If you limit it to the first 6, there are still weaknesses to Fairy, Flying, Ice, and Rock, as well as Ghost. Overall, a pretty well balanced typing. A lot of the common offensive typings here standing as weaknesses. But then again, you might have heard by now that I've said these for just about every team. So nothing unusual there. Just lots of mons have those weaknesses. Taking a look at the base stat total, the Bouffalant are top 3 in terms of their speed, really being helped out here by the 2 mons above 120 with Talonflame and Cyclizar, as well as Lycanroc Dusk helping out at 110. However, as mentioned, there are a couple of spots where the team looks a little weaker. They are bottom 3 in terms of attack, with 2 mons under 70 base attack, which isn't a lot, but the real issue here in terms of attack is there are only 3 at or above 100. This, of course, also doesn't account for huge power on Azumarill, which does make that 50 base attack look a lot more impressive. However, the base stat is low, so that's what I look at. The team also has the bottom of conference average defense with 3 mons under 70 and only 2 above 100. So overall there, a little bit on the lower side in terms of the base stat total, but that is definitely okay. Looking at the speed tiers, they go from Talonflame, 126 at the top, down to Gastrodon at 39 at the bottom. They have fantastic speed gaps along the way, forcing awkward speed investments. The one exception is Wo-Chien at 70, down to Azumarill at 50. But then again, we're getting into the lower aspects where the mons aren't typically investing speed, so it is not the most necessary speed gap to have. Otherwise, looks fantastic. Well-rounded team. Hopefully the move pools can make up for some of the a little bit lower stats. Michael?
Yeah, they definitely have some good move pools here. Looking at just their priority options, Azumarill has Aqua Jet, which I'm pretty sure if you get off a Belly Drum, Terra Water, and click Aqua Jet, Showdown just immediately gives you the entire game. Lycanroc has fantastically powerful Accelerox, as well as Sucker Punch if you want to hit a particular weakness, and Slitherwing has huge first impressions. For their hazards, they've got 3 Rockers, 2 Spikers, and 1 Toxic Spiker, so doing just fine there. The removal isn't as great. They've got Rapid Spin on Cyclizar and Defog on Talonflame, and, those are at least very fast, so I think they're fine, just depending on the matchup, they might be a little bit awkward to get to work. For pivoting, they've got U-Turn on Talon, Slitherwing, and Cyclizar, as well as Volt Switch on Toxtricity, so plenty to work with there. Screens options, Goldango gets dual screens, but more I'd expected to see come from the Wo-Chien. For Cleric, Doxbun can be passing around wishes if it chooses to. Wo-Chien and Cyclizar both get knockoff, which I think are 2 very good knockoff users here. For Taunt, they've got 5 Taunt users, notably Talonflame, Lycanroc, Cyclizar, and Wo-Chien. Looking at their status options, Paralysis can come from Goldango and Toxtricity, Burns can come from Slitherwing and Talonflame, Toxic can come from Toxtricity, and Wo-Chien, of course, has Leech Seed options. Looking then at their boosting options, I already mentioned Azumarill, of course, can Belly Drum up and become absolutely terrifying. Doxbun can pair its well-baked body ability and the defense boosts it gets with Body Press. Garchomp, of course, gets Swords Dance. Gastrodon can use Amnesia or Curse to bulk up on either side. Goldango gets Nasty Plot to make its terrifying Make It Rains even stronger. Lycanroc can get Swords Dance or Bulk Up to become an absolutely terrifying Cleaner or Sweeper. Slitherwing gets Bulk Up, Flame Charge, and Body Press options. Talonflame, of course, gets Bulk Up, but I think we'll see it more in a supportive role. And Toxtricity, of course, for whatever reason, gets Shift Gear. So, it does. Nate, run us through the litany of good Terra options to your team, because I see a lot of them.
Yeah, although Garchomp itself cannot Terra, straight into the second round pick still cannot Terra, Goldango certainly can and loves the extra power on Make It Rain, that signature move there, as well as something like Shadow Ball or even Focus Blast if it wants to go into fighting, or just forego that for the Terra Blast itself to get an actually accurate fighting move, or it could also even go a defensive option to eliminate weaknesses or take advantage of something else that comes in. Maybe something like a Dark Terra would be kind of interesting there. You already mentioned Azu can get even more power somehow with the Terra into water, though don't forget about the strong play roughs that can fire off too, especially with Fairy not exactly being the most spammable type on the physical side because there aren't that many good users. Slithering also would love the ability to grab extra power on one of its stab moves. Something like First Impression buffed up by Bug would be huge, although it could also go into a defensive type, which could help it set up a little bit more with some of the defensive options that you mentioned earlier too, with things like Bulk Up or Will-O-Wisp. Talonflame could become a defensive type too, help out its utility sets a little bit, as could Gastro. I like Gastro as a few options. Things like Poison, Steel, Fairy, or Ghost stand out a lot as defensive types, and some ones that also can resist the grass moves that may be coming out. The same types also stand out here for Wo-Chen defensively, along with Water, of course, to give it a very different look on what is a very bulky profile on a overall pretty poor typing. Toxtricity can obviously increase his stab, but would also really like to get stab on Punk Rock Boom Burst, or take the Disguise to avoid an obvious ground move, as we talked about previously too. Lycanroc would appreciate to have stab on close combat, or to just boost the power of Accelerock even further. Even Duckspun can change types pretty well too with the fire immunity. Steel and Grass make a lot of sense here too, as well as Water or Ghost for just defensive profile, plus even Fighting to give stab to body press while still resisting Dark. And finally, without Shed Tail, Cyclizar actually has tons of options it has now, from a defensive type to survive a hit to take advantage of Regenerator, to an offensive type to get stab on one of its several coverage options. Overall, it's a pretty solid team. Just a little concerned about it shining in any one area, aside from maybe something like the priority. And I'm just hoping to try and give it a real solid identity after playing with it for a couple of weeks. What do you think, Steve?
I definitely like the selection of mons here. Lots of mons that I expect to do very well. Of course, the two up top stand out a lot, the Golden Go and Garchomp. Fantastic pair. Can't wait to see them in action. And of course, the Bouffalant and yourself have really brought out a lot of fantastic results. So, high expectations from the start with all of these great mons. Michael, what are your thoughts on the team?
Yeah, it's not a particularly flashy team. You don't see a whole bunch of standouts, I think, besides like that Garchomp and the Goldango, maybe the Slitherwing, but it's definitely a dark horse in my opinion because, man, when you really dig down into it, this team actually has a ton of versatility and a lot of potential. And I think it's just going to be particularly hard to pilot, identifying what your win conditions are in each game and keeping them alive. And if there's one coach that can do that, it's Nate here. So I think it's actually going to do very well, even if it doesn't look like it at first glance. All right, bring us home. I think we've only got one team left.
Yes, it is the last pick in the draft. It is Chad Seattle Steamrollers who grabbed at the top there Dragonite, followed by Iron Treads, Cinderace, Grimmsnarl, Gengar, Rotom Heat, Pelipper, Noivern, Klefki, Floatzel, and Grafaiai. The strong attackers, with several removers, several prankster support options, and lots of momentum. Yeah, this is a Chad team, and the amount of resists and ways he has to get rocks off the field to help support things like the D-Knight, Cinder, Noivern, just very impressive. This team screams Chad to me, Steve. What do you think about the typings and stats?
Looking at the typings for this team, it is one of the teams with the fewest number of weaknesses, only being weak to electric, rock, and ice. Of course, having the worst in league matchups to electric and rock, and ice having those 4 times weaknesses as the only weaknesses, but a lot of things there. Looking at the resist, they have the best in conference matchup against bug, fairy, fighting, flying, and grass. If you limit this to just looking at the first 6 picks, in addition to ice and rock, which still show up as weaknesses, there are also weaknesses to ground, water, and dark. Notably, though, within the first 6 mons for the Steamrollers, they have the best matchup in electric, and it just becomes a weakness due to their 7th round pick Pelipper and 10th round Floatzel, picking up that Rain Core. Electric could be a little bit of an issue, especially against the Rain Core. They do have Iron Treads and Rotom Heat to handle it, but outside of those two, everything else is neutral, so that could be a little susceptible. Another fun note to mention here is 9 out of their 11 mods have either a bug resist or quad resist, along with no weaknesses, giving a amazing bug matchup where on average the bug types are doing about 50% damage to the entire team. Just a really fun stat to see. Taking a look at the base stat totals for the Steamrollers, they have some highs and some lows, either being in the top 3 or bottom 3 in every stat. Starting off, they are the top of the conference in terms of speed, having an average speed 14 points higher than the average. This is led by Noivern, Cinderace, and Floatzel all up there, as well as having 6 Mons above 100. Really helps out. Additionally, their low, which we'll talk about in speed tiers, is not as low as a lot of the other teams, which could be an issue in Trick Room. They are also top 3 in terms of special attack, led by Gengar, mostly Gengar, but the Rotom Heat's there who can help out, and also Dragonite with base 100 could be kind of a surprise bring here, especially in the reign of Pelipper with moves like Hurricane, Thunder, and Hydro Pump. And that is the end of the good news for the Steamrollers. They are bottom 3 in terms of HP with 5 Mons under 70, no Mons above 100. Bottom 3 in terms of attack with 3 Mons under 70. Bottom 3 in terms of defense with 4 Mons under 70. And bottom 3 in terms of special defense with 1 under 70. And no particular standouts, with the highest one being Rotom Heat at 107. Taking a look at the speed tiers, as mentioned before, their lower side is a lot higher than a lot of other teams, with Grimmsnarl at 60. And then again, Grimmsnarl is a big priority user, so how often does that 60 really matter? Up to Noivern at the top end at 123. Even though they have kind of this condensed range with such a low bottom end, they do still have a pretty big gap between Iron Treads at 106 down to Rotom Heat at 86. That is a kind of a sweet spot for a lot of Mons, although in this generation, I also found that area a little hard to find decent Mons in, especially after the first couple rounds. So perhaps there aren't a ton, but if there are, those Mons will have plenty of extra EVs to invest while still outspeeding the next relevant threat in Rotom Heat. All in all, very much highs and lows in terms of the stats and typing for the team. But Michael, is there something in the move pool to make up for this very low bulk?
They've got a ton of different options in their move pools that we'll go over here. Starting off with priority, Cinderace gets Sucker Punch, Dragonite has great E-speeds, Floatzel gets Aqua Jet, and Grimmsnarl has Fake Out and Sucker Punch as priority options. So a lot of good stuff there. Hazards, they're a little weak on. Iron Treads gets Rocks, Klefki gets Spikes, and Gengar gets Toxic Spikes. So some good users there, but just not particularly deep. The removal, however, Iron Treads, of course, gets Rapid Spin, and while not as good as Great Tusk per se, is still fantastic removal, on top of the Defog coming from Noivern and Court Change possibilities coming from Cinderace. For pivoting, they've got U-Turn on Cinderace, Grafaiai, Noivern, and Pelipper, Volt Switch on Iron Treads, and Parting Shot on Grafaiai and Grimmsnarl, both of which can make it priority with Prankster if they want. Screens, they've got dual Prankster screens from Grimmsnarl and Klefki. I'd love to get Prankster screens once, and this guy got it twice in the same draft. Cleric options, they don't have any, unfortunately. Knockoff users, though, they have Grafaiai, Iron Treads, and Pelipper, though, so some good knockoff users there. 6 great Taunters, all of them being fast or Prankster users. And then we get into their status options. 4 Thunderwave users, 2 of them being Prankster, 2 Will-O-Wisp users, and 2 Toxic users, 1 of them being Prankster as well. Getting into their boosting options, Cinderace can run Bulk Up, Agility, or now it gets Sword Stance to have absolutely devastating Pyro Balls. Dragonite, of course, gets Dragon Dance. Floatzel gets Bulk Up to pair with its Swift Swim ability in that rain. Gengar gets Nasty Plot. Grafaiai gets Sword Stance that it could pair with Unburden if it wants to be cheeky 1 week. Grimmsnarl gets Bulk Up. Iron Treads gets Iron Defense and Body Press, and then Klefki gets Calm Mind, Iron Defense, and Stored Power if you wanted a offensive Klefki set, which I'm not sure I've ever actually seen, but hey, it could work. He's got another Prankster screen users, what does he need Klefki for? Nate, do tell us about what Terra could look like coming from this team, though.
Well, it will not be coming from Dragonite, who cannot Terra, thank goodness. But Iron Treads would love a little more power on Earthquake, or the ability to resist a few more moves that it wouldn't, with something like, say, Water would be a cool option there to resist things like Water and Fire. Cinder doesn't necessarily like to Terra, but as mentioned earlier with Meowscarada, can potentially go with something like a Blaze set with Pyro Ball to boost that even further beyond. Grimmsnarl would like to go with defensive typing too. Something like Steel or Ghost would be really interesting for it. Speaking of Ghost, Gengar likes a little bit more power on Shadow Ball, as well as Stab on something like Fairy or Fighting coverage that it already has. Rotom Heat can switch things up with Steel or Water, or as mentioned before, of course, can just stick with Electric. Pelipper can shed a weakness and so keep up the damage with the other stab if it would like to, or go ground to avoid an obvious electric move coming in, and its partner Floatzel wants more power on the Wave Crash. Noivern obviously wants to go normal for Boom Burst, but has a couple other options, something like Fire to boost up the Flamethrower. Klefki can shed weaknesses pretty cheekily, maybe, though it is already a very outstanding defensive type. And Grafaiai can lean into its poison typing for more power on say, the Gunk Shot. Overall, Chad's team, it's pretty obvious what the game plan is. We've already gone over the prankster users, we've already gone over the screens, we've gone over some of the setup and strong threats. But Steve, what exactly is anyone going to do about that?
They're going to, if the history is any indication, ignore all of this advice and go into the match blind. I definitely recommend having a plan in this matchup for specifically Prankster and probably bring some sort of screens removal. That could be very good in this matchup as it seems to be a key. You also got to keep in mind, of course, the Rain Core and then limiting Dragon Knight's ability to sweep. There's lots of things to remember, but a lot of the sets are fairly predictable. So hopefully coaches are able to prepare well for it. But knowing Chad and the way things go, this will become a dominant force at some point in the season. Michael, what are your thoughts on the team?
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's got a lot of straightforward options, but there are just so many and they're so good. I think this is just going to be a case of week after week. You can only prepare for so many things, and you just have to hope and pray that you prepared for the things that Chad actually brought that week. You're going to prepare for the Rain Core, and you're going to get destroyed by setup Dragonite. You're going to be prepared for Prankster screen shenanigans, and you're just going to be destroyed by a Banded Cinderace and a Specs Gengar. There's a ton of different options that this team can use to really just ruin your day, and man, preparing for it is going to be a horrible experience. But hey, that's Pokemon. That's what we play for some reason, I guess.
I know I already know that it will not be a horrible experience going through this season because that will wrap up the Johto Conference. Thanks to the two of you for joining once again on the Draft Breakdown. Join us again next week for the Week 1 Power Rankings. We like to do Power Rankings to check in every week to see how everyone's doing. Nothing preliminary here. We kind of want to see how the teams shake out a little bit, but please join us from week to week as we go over these teams as they go through the season, and we'll see you then.